Hello, welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. I'm David Wheatley, and we're here to talk all things leadership. So welcome to another episode of the Humanergy Leadership Podcast, and we're going to take a bit of a detour as we go into 2022 occasionally with some deeper leadership conversations. So if you came for a 5-minute snippet, this isn't the episode for you. But if you came for something like 9 or 10 5-minute snippets, you might enjoy the full 45 minutes or so of what we're going to talk about. So I'm joined today by two guests. Judy Brown, been on the podcast before, long-term collaborator, long-term executive coach and organizational development consultant, and writer of one of my favorite books, A Leader's Guide to Reflective Practice. And if I've ever recommended the poem Fire to you, that's where it comes from. So welcome, Judy. And Rick Eigenbrod. And Rick is another long-term executive coach and leadership development, organizational development consultant. And I'm in the process of reading his book, What Happens When You Get What You Want. So, so far, so good. So I hope it just gets better as we go. And the idea of these conversations is we're just going to bring up a leadership topic and just kind of talk through it, because we've had some offline and felt like they might be value. So if they are, we'll keep doing them. If they're not, we'll go back to just talking to ourselves. Does that sound about right? So welcome, Judy. Welcome, Rick. And our question today is, what does leadership look like in 2020 and onwards?
Well, I realized that one of the threads of that for Rick and me, which is actually what brought the three of us together today, is realizing how important rich and open conversations are for guiding ourselves and others in these seasons of ambiguity, uncertainty, unpredictability, not like it was before. The things that we usually do don't seem to work, circumstances that have changed. And I think what we'd want to offer, the three of us with lots of years in sum total working with leaders, is that that conversation, which at first glance seems to suggest something way too relaxed and unstructured and unfocused to be of great use, turns out to be something really powerful. And so the way we ended up together, David and I have known each other and work off and on for 20 years, longer.
20, yeah. 22, 23.
Right. And Rick and I have met by what I would call a fortuitous accident, which is we were in a program together on Zoom. And the facilitator threw the two of us with another person into a small group. And I never go in small groups. And all of a sudden, I found myself in this small group with Rick and another really gifted person. And we had maybe a 15-minute conversation at most. And there was something about it that left me thinking, I want to have a longer conversation. And so and generally I am too shy as a small town Midwesterner to do this. But I said to Rick, I'd really like to talk more. And so what began is this series of conversations that with no agenda and just following our own curiosity and what was going on in our own lives and asking each other questions. And that's evolved, Rick, over 18 months or so, probably.
Yeah, something like that, Judy. I mean, I was thinking as we're speaking, David, your question, not just your question about leadership, but the purpose statement that you have about operating in the service of the greater good. There's such richness in that. And I think one of the things that has just been enjoyable, surprising, in some way ironic, is the less Judy and I structured our conversations, the richer they became. And so the agenda think about it, to spend that much time with no agenda. I even had a thought at one point, like if somebody could respond or was listening to us talk about the time we put into this, they were going, well, yeah, conversations aren't productive. And it really took me down this very interesting, for me, thought about productivity, how it drives us, what is it, we act, etc. And so in some way, the more spacious we allowed the conversations to have, the more spaciousness, as John O'Donohue said, spaciousness is where possibility lies. So anything we are offering today in some way is a consequence of those conversations, which could not have been planned out a priori.
Which in some ways gets to the heart of the question, because what I'm hearing there is the need for conversation. And especially when we're in Zoom land quite a bit these days,
Yes.
people really struggle to create organic conversation.
Yes.
And one of the things I've been working with leaders on is emulate the same organic water cooler conversations that you would have, because that's what we're missing at the moment. We're not just creating a space to say, hey, how you doing? And let's just talk about this and have some loose chat about 3 or 4 things, because we're back to back in Zoom meetings that focus elsewhere.
Yeah, there's a way in which the pandemic has unfrozen so much. And if we're not careful, we're going to go back and try and put it together exactly the way it was.
No.
And so Judy and I are talking about, I've given a lot of thought to it, and I blame you, David, for this, because you've made me be reflective. But one of the things that I think these conversations are and have been, without putting a label to it, is what Peter Senge called C-level work. C-level work is work we do on the quality of our thinking and reasoning. So Judy and I have been able to, in a most organic way, spend a ton of time thinking how we think about things, our work, leadership, very, very sort of familiar terms like productivity. And so there's a delight in them that we have taken both in the doing and in the retrospect. And here's the agenda when we get together. Today, I'd like to talk about.
Yeah.
Can you imagine in corporate America, and wouldn't it be wonderful? There was space for people to get together where the only agenda was, today, I'd like to talk about. And we have the luxury of thinking about how we think about things.
Yeah,
Well,
I was going to say, I think the Japanese talk about the leader, the CEO has a corner office because they should spend a lot of time staring out of it. And they also say you should never disturb a person staring out of the window because they're thinking great thoughts. And I guess that's what we're trying to recreate here a little bit, is let's think some great thoughts and bounce off of each other, because that's what we think, it's what leaders should be doing in 2022 and beyond. Judy?
Well, and sometimes the great thoughts come out of an aside. So, Rick might say what he wants to talk about is this. And because I have a tendency to veer off in other directions, I might say, that really reminds me of what it's like when I'm kayaking out on the creek. And that conversation might lead to a notion of what happens if you stop paddling so hard. And that actually is a quite profound question, and takes us back into the question of leadership. What happens if you just see how the current is today and you follow the energy of the natural process, which is a really very powerful notion about the kind of leadership that we need increasing amounts of. So this ability to let the conversation wander the same way that the creek does is at the heart of it. So there's nothing, occasionally we'll say to each other, this is really off the topic. And then we laugh because we realize nothing is off the topic. Nothing is off the topic.
Well,
Yeah.
you're getting at my deepest whitewater kayaking instructor background there, because what we would always say to people is you should either be going faster than the current or slower than the current, but you shouldn't let the current take control. Which, when I was thinking about that, as you were saying, that's about control. What you're
Yes.
saying in some ways is it's good to let go of that control sometimes and see what happens. And I think that's a challenge for leaders.
It's a huge challenge. David, for me, it brings up, I mean, Judy and I, over the course of these, I think we've re-examined our beliefs about leadership, our perspectives on leadership, certainly our perspectives on the nature of the interaction we have in our organizations, the whole thing about the water cooler. Here's a couple of sort of core sort of principles, I think, that I would offer in retrospect that I'm reminded of about conversation. One is this notion that our lives and our companies they're the consequence of our conversations, the ones we're having, and just as importantly, the ones we're not. So that's really come out for me as a pillar. How much do we pay attention to conversation? And secondly, I think what you raised, at least for me, was to go back and reflect on not just the role of the leader and how that's changing, but to think about what is the contribution of a leader in this concept of the high value contribution of the leader, defined in some way as what is it that the leader and only the leader can do. And my sense is, our leaders are so fragmented, like everything else around us, that to get high value from the leader means the leader has to do that reflective work you just talked about. I mean, when I say to people, what's your high value contribution as a leader? They really don't know what I'm talking about. So I say, start with what is it you and only you can do? And it tends to expand into really the important work that they must do. And there's a list of things that come out of that. And in a sense, it's like their high value contribution gets clear, and it also clarifies what the work of the group, for example, their team is.
Do you find though that that these days leaders are operating a level beneath where they need to be operating because of everything that's going on? And so the one thing that's missing is that high level thinking, that staring out the window time, because they're being forced down a peg.
Judy?
This last week, I spent 3 days in a leadership development program for people who lead life care communities of various kinds. You know how things have been there with COVID for the last 2 years. And so they're scrambling at a level that they call the dance floor. They're just down there in all the work. And if you give them 3 days to think about it on Zoom together from all over the country, all of a sudden they begin to realize they need to be up on the balcony. They have to be able to see the dance that's going on, and to be able to see that in a way that provides some sense of calm and awareness to the people they work with. But it took 3 days of us together exploring that idea before people began to think of that as legitimate. Think of that as genuinely their work.
Yeah, because they're afraid to leave the people beneath them alone, and they feel like they're abandoning them to go do the strategic thinking.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that it's a very complex set of issues, David, as to why leaders do that sort of thing. One is they came up through the organization on the basis of what one of my clients calls domain expertise. You're the smartest kid in the room. You were when you were in grammar school. And there's a sense about themselves of measuring themselves and grounding themselves as the smartest kid in the room. Well, as you go up, you can't be the smartest kid in the room. It's a limiting factor. So what would be interesting, for example, is I asked the leader to go off and say, think about what's your high value contribution? What is it you and only you can do? And then when you get that, go back to your team. Say, this is what I think my high value contribution is. What do you all think it is? So for example, let me just link to what I think is just this really inspiring kind of mission statement, if you will, a purpose that you have. It's to work in the service of the greater good. What does that mean? It means somebody has to really be clear about what their intention is. Mm-hmm. Right? They have to be clear about what their boundary conditions are. which means two things to me as a leader, for example. You better know your intention, really know your intention, because they will. You'll express it every day in every way. The second thing is boundary conditions. Set boundary conditions. What's a boundary condition around that greater good? You can never, ever, in my organization, sub-optimize the whole to optimize a piece. And that goes on all the time.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind. I did some work at a credit union many, many years ago that was having conflict at the top of the organization. And I call it the most easy money I've ever made, because I went in and interviewed the C-suite and they told me that their bonus system was 75% individual performance and 25% team performance. And so you already have the answer, don't you? Well, that's what they did. They sat around this boardroom table and they're saying, well, that's silly, and switched it around, and lo and behold, you get increased performance. And I think, Rick, to what you're talking about, what we would call that is delegate to yourself last. And I think the problem is we fill our cup up, and then whatever overflows we give to somebody else, as opposed to saying, whatever comes in, I give to somebody else, and whatever's left is uniquely mine.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Judy. I think one of the reasons they don't do that work is because it's hard.
Yeah.
Reflection's hard. I mean, look, as you go up the ladder, it gets easier and easier to do easy. Easy means familiar. Easy means my anxiety and discomfort levels are low. So I literally, at some level, am operating to minimize my discomfort. So one of the things that the leaders come up with around what they and only they can do is take on their development as a human being. And that we have tons of evidence these days from Robert Anderson's work, from Kagan's work, et cetera, that the development of the leader, and one can say everybody else, but let's focus on the leader. The development of a leader as a human being is a business issue. And you and only you can take that on.
Which goes back to, I know something we've mentioned before, Hammarskjöld's the longest journey of them all is the journey inwards. And we need to keep taking that journey inwards, because that's what, in my mind, is what leadership's about, continuing to learn and grow as an individual.
Well, and for leaders to realize, or all of us as human beings to realize, that when the anxiety we feel is really welling up in us because we're being called to step into a dimension of ourselves that is not very familiar, that means we're in the right spot, as opposed to wanting to run terrified from the room and go back to what we know so well. And to just help people sit with that feeling and realize that it's the edge of their own development and their organization's development that requires they step into it, that they lean into it. It's a counterintuitive move. I mean, whenever it's new for me, I just want to go do what I've been doing. Thank you. I'm really good at it.
I did a podcast recently, an episode recently on the 4 stages of adventure, which comes from my adventure education roots. And one of the elements of that is that your best learning happens at frontier adventure, which is the 3rd level, where you're actually pushed, you're stretched a little bit, and it's really hard work. And, they would always say at college, you spend some time there, then you come back to level 2 to reinforce what you just learned at level 3. And level 1 was play. So that's just floating up and down the river. And level 4, of course, was misadventure, which we have to try and avoid at all costs.
Except you never know where misadventure is going to take you.
No, right. You don't. And if you're in the frontier adventure, that's always a risk. And, if you survive it, that's a massive learning experience.
Well, therein, David, lies leadership. What's the challenge of leadership going forward? We have to change our relationship to discomfort and comfort, mine and everybody else's. One of the things I've observed, I think, about leaders and their teams is, and again, this is a requirement for the leader. What is the leader, they and only they can do? It's increase their self-awareness, right? Mm-hmm. Only they can do that. People can help with feedback. But one of the things I've observed, and there's a little line in my head, is they will stand as much discomfort as you, the leader, can tolerate. The boundaries for them and their discomfort really aren't their discomfort. It's the leader's ability to tolerate discomfort. And what we know from all the research, and I think you're saying it in different ways, is development begins at the boundary of discomfort. All the work from Center for Creative Leadership, we grow and develop as leaders in the crucible.
So I was talking to a leader this morning, though, and she's been running an organization for 10 years, and the last 2 have been highly, highly in that discomfort zone because of staffing issues, of legislation issues, and things like that. And we're at the point of burnout. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of leaders that are there. What can we offer them to say how you dig down and find that next bottle of motivation?
I'm going to change the question slightly, David. I don't think it's a question of finding motivation. I think it's a question of helping them find some internal platform. I call it steely stillness. Discovering that place of steely stillness, where no matter what swirls around you, and that's the world we're in now, it is really swirling. And it affects the man, it affects the leaders, it affects everybody else. So they're motivated. They may have really wonderful intentions. But I think what they lack is that place to go that gets quiet and steely. Steely means you stand for something, right? Look, at this point, I don't think they're paying us to be right. I think they're paying us to choose. There's no right answers out there. The right answer is the one we choose and then agree we're going to implement. And so finding that place in ourselves, individually and collectively. Judy, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I was going to say, and we choose, and we start an experiment, and we learn from the experiment, and we adjust, and we are able to communicate, which is back to the conversations, how it is we're thinking about things and why this particular path makes sense. And we can handle then incoming that suggests we need to adjust here or there, because our people have a sense of the thought processes that have gone into this, and in the best of worlds have been part of that thought process. So that swings me back to the notion of the conversations. I'm struck as the 3 of us are talking about what happens when you take, I'm thinking about how different our backgrounds. So David, what did you study? You studied adventure,
environmental and outdoor education.
Right. All right. That's a million worlds from what I studied. I was an English major with an interest in theater and drama. Rick, a totally different background. And yet when we drop into a conversation with each other about what matters, we offer new understandings that we can incorporate within ourselves, I think is what I would want to say. I mean, Rick's steely stillness, I get that because I have herons out here and they just stand there no matter what. Sometimes they just stand in the snowstorm like this, steely stillness. So you absorb things from each other when you seek out conversational partners that come from really different places. I mean, beyond different places, as in England and New Orleans and Northern Michigan, but I mean really different places, because then we bring lenses that not only bring clarity to ourselves in terms of that platform, but we offer things to each other that we might not otherwise have seen or understood.
So the steely stillness, I read a few years ago that one of the few things that all the Fortune 500 CEOs have in common is that they all have some form of meditative practice, which in some ways is identifying a steely stillness.
Yes,
that
somewhere
they go to that place where they can be quiet.
Yes,
it is. David, you gave me a great way to think about my background. You said your field was outdoor adventure education. Mine was indoor adventure education. My PhD is in clinical psychology.
That's really inside adventure education, isn't it? It's like,
Right.
Yeah,
yeah.
it's
Indoor
inside
and-
adventure, and it is an adventure.
Yes, it is an adventure.
Thank you for that.
That comes back to the Dag Hammarskjöld stuff, and that's what, in my mind, is remarkable about his work. That the Secretary General of the United Nations would make time to go into the wilderness and be quiet, and capture some thoughts and journal and then publish that for the rest of us to take benefit from. But I once had my coaching described as an oasis of sanity in amongst this desert of craziness.
Wow.
That's
And
lovely.
I think that, that person, I didn't have to say anything. I just had to be there, because that created the space for the higher level thinking.
One of the things I'll do sometimes is, I think we all get in the presence of leaders. And we virtually now instead of in person, but I find myself in the presence of people with the title leaders, asking myself this simple question to try and get a sense about them. Would I follow this person? And I'm always amazed at how quickly and strongly I get a response. It's not like it's a right, wrong response. It's a choice that I, as a potential follower, would make. And then I can deconstruct it a little bit. And I think that this notion about where does steely stillness come from, in some way, every leader has to be able to answer this question. Why would they follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Because truly, if you don't know, they won't. And they can't tell you why they'd follow you. That's your job, to go out into the wilderness and figure out why they would follow you. And they have a sense about, that.
Václav Havel said, he was jailed as a dissident poet and came out to be president of his country. And in the middle of what turned out to be a velvet revolution, but might have been a bloody one, he was just burned out. Back, David, to what you said, what do you do when you just run out of energy about things? So he went out in the country to stay at a friend's house. And the guys in the city, in Prague, said, look, we just have to have you back here because there's so much going on. So he allowed himself to be dragged back. But he said what he realized was there wasn't a thing that only he could do that they couldn't do for themselves, except that there was something about his non-anxious presence that made it possible for them to move ahead without confusion. Those were his exact words about it. A non-anxious presence, which comes from the platform of steely stillness, that allowed them to do the work they needed to do without confusion. It's such an interesting notion, and how each of us, maybe he found his way through poetry because he was a poet, or maybe it was all the quiet time in jail, which Martin Luther King did to write his letter from a Birmingham jail. But whatever it is, to have that in your life and be able to tap it when you need to as a leader.
Yeah, Nelson Mandela is the other great example of that, isn't it? That you give them solitude for a long enough time, they come out great thinkers. That's maybe we could tweak the US correctional system with that in mind. Who knows? So, I mean, what we've been talking about then is that the leaders of the future are going to have to find that space and then make that space for the people around them.
Yes.
And have the people around them understand that space is an organizational, is a requirement for the success of the organization. And by definition, part of their role, their work as a team, is to see that leader gets that space and on down. And to be able to not be tempted through the fact that they get anxious, to regress back into thinking they have to have all the answers, thinking that they're the smartest and acting like they're the smartest kid in the room. That everybody has a sense then about what high value contribution is. And we're focusing on the leader right now, for example, but it goes all the way down because each person down. And oh, by the way, it's not about hierarchy. At any moment, wouldn't we love the capacity in the organization to create leadership and followership as the situation that requires? It's not a title, it's not a role, it's not whatever. It's the capacity to create followership in the moment.
And you see that in crises across the world, don't you, where somebody steps up who hasn't had a title, but steps into that crisis because they're more centered than the people who may have the titles.
Exactly. A friend of mine who I lost recently, and it was absolutely brilliant. And he had a number of ways in which he thought about this. What's a plank in a platform of steely stillness? And he tells a story about an executive that was talking to a bunch of college kids. And one of them said to the leader, "My God, you live in a world where every decision you make has cost or benefit, but has cost. You could make mistakes that could sink this company. How do you live with that? How do you do that?" And his answer was, "You need to know what ditch you want to die in." It's not that I have the right answer. Again, the notion that there are right answers out there, yes, it's true in simple things, Knevin model. It's really, yeah, there are places where it's a right answer. But in the world we live in the world we're leading in, there are no easy right answers. And so in some way, each leader comes face to face with that moment of not, give up whether I'm going to live or die. Just give it up. But what ditch do I want to die in? Where am I going to take a stand?
So what you're talking about there, Rick, is really the idea that once the leaders found the space, they have to make a decision. But it's not just any decision. They have to make a decision within a structure that allows that decision to fail fast and learn from it. Mm-hmm. And that, in my mind, is one of the biggest challenges of leadership, is creating the environment where fail fast and learn is expected. It's kind of like what in the IT programming world they call agile. Well, let's build something and then beat it up, and then we'll build it again and beat it up until we get there, rather than the old way, which was we're not going to build this until we're perfectly sure we know what we're going to get. And then quite often it would fail. And yet that fail fast environment, what do you recommend leaders do to create that fail fast environment? Judy?
I think the thing that is critical to that is a quality of totally open communication and conversation, so that the leader actually has information coming back in about the first step that they took on this path that's their decision, and what are people everywhere seeing as incoming data about that, and what kind of adjustment and learning is needed to keep the endeavor on a path of vitality. I think that the leader alone can't do that. And if the leader is revered, then people won't tell the leader that it looks like you're like 3 degrees off in this direction. And if we follow this for 6 months, we're going to be in the ditch. It has to be a circumstance where people are willing to bring their best thinking. I'm thinking, Rick, the conversations we have where you say, well, we just should offer them our best thinking. What else have we got? Well, that's not just true of us when we're leading something. It's true of everybody else. And we have to see those offerings in that light. They're the offerings of an organization that is collectively trying to muddle and think its way through just these tremendously changing dynamics, which we all know is true of the health field, for instance, but it's true of the educator field. I mean, almost any place you think of now is in that kind of just shifting circumstances, where if everybody's not watching and offering what they're seeing, we aren't going to be able to find our way through it.
So we get to a little chicken and egg there, don't we? So everybody can bring their best thinking, but we need an environment where our best thinking is appreciated. Rick?
Yeah, my mind's going so fast. Sorry. Usually my mouth faster than my mind. It's just the opposite right now. Certainly, I think there's the system dynamic aspect of this that really has to change. I think one of the things that lovely example you earlier, David, is why do we act the way we, because the system is perfectly set up to have us act that way. So for example, think about the systems and the reward systems, et cetera, policies, practices, procedures that are set up in our organizations to see that we don't, to minimize our ability to experience failure, et cetera. And so I think there's a system dynamic, policies, practice, procedures, structures. I think what Judy said is a part of it, but it also, what went through my brain is, I go back to something we said earlier, is we have to change the way we think about things. You know, we have to go back and think about, how have we been thinking about this? Does it serve us? Where does it serve us? Where does it not? And we need to literally do C-level thinking, to think about, examine our deep assumptions. The term, the implicate order, to make the invisible visible so we can do something about it. And that the notion of the power of making the invisible visible, I think, you know, and they, when the leader says, this is the way, you know, we need to think about how we've been thinking, and there's a new way in which we need to think, they're going to be smelling the leader as to whether that leader can stand the discomfort that's about to come out of that. Forgive the phrase, but they will assess the leader's ability to tolerate the uncertainty, the anxiety, the ambiguity, the fun of, you know, of what's to come.
Well, that feels like that's a good note to stop this chapter, because we've had a 40-minute conversation. We'll be getting Rick and Judy back for another episode to have another of these longer conversations in a few weeks. But Rick, thanks very much. Closing thoughts?
I think here's a thought for everybody. If our lives and our companies are the consequence of the conversations we're having and those we're not, Judy and I are so now keenly aware of the consequence of the conversation we had. I would invite people to think about this question. What is the conversation you're not having? Who are you not having it with? Why aren't you having it? And what would be different if you did?
Can you top that, Judy?
No.
Well, Rick, Judy, thanks for being here. And we look forward to having another informal chat with a very loose agenda next time. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. I'm David Wheatley. And we're brought to you by the book, What Great Teams Do Great, available now at all good bookstores. Thanks to Brian Spencer and Finkel for the music. Please share any feedback and suggestions. I'm available through humanergy.com. And go to iTunes, like, subscribe, and leave us a review so that other people can find us. In the meantime, until next time we meet, stay healthy.